All right. Welcome, everybody, to the podcast. Today we have Jason Thacker on. Jason is the author of The Age of AI, which is a book around artificial intelligence and the future of humanity. Jason, thanks for hopping on with us and talking. This has actually been a podcast in the making for, I think almost a year at this point, since we kind of first got connected and everything. So it's like having a baby almost, because I've been like waiting for this conversation for almost a year. So it's a good time. But why don't you tell everybody a little bit just about yourself and who you are, and then we'll hop in some other questions.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Matt. As you said, yeah, it has been a few months or more in the making for us to be able to get together. So I'm excited to do that. I would say apologize to listeners for the mower in the background, along with most people who are able to work remote. I'm remote at home and I can't control when my neighbors are mowing their lawn. So I apologize for that extra background noise. But I serve as an associate research fellow at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is the public policy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. And our goal and mandate by the commission, from the convention that is to educate and equip the local church to engage the most pressing issues of the day with the hope of the gospel. And to that end, I focus primarily in my research role and my communications role, focusing on the impact of technology in society and ethics. And then one of the big issues that as of late in the last few years, it really surrounds the focus of artificial intelligence and its kind of ubiquitousness in our culture, and then also a lot of pressing ethical issues that come along with it. And so that's why I wrote the book, The Age of AI, the Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity, is to dive into a lot of those issues and intentionally writing that to be accessible for all people. This isn't just specifically for technologists or developers or ethicists or theologians, but it's really for the everyday believer to say, how is this technology being developed? What is it being used for? And then how do we ultimately use this technology for good? And so kind of laying out a framework for what that is and why we do that. And that's kind of the thrust of a lot of my ministry and a lot of my writing and work, is to approach these technology issues to help equip the church to be proactively engaging them rather than always responding to issues as they come about.
Yeah, I think also, by the way, you'll probably hear my wife she's a pediatric physical therapist. And so she's working remotely through teletherapy. So I think that's just like one of the things I mentioned in the last podcast was like, it's great that everybody's giving everybody a lot of grace around this time, just as we're all figuring this out together. So, but I think going back to what you were saying, having the church get a head start in this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the past, the church has kind of been behind the eight ball in a number of cultural conversations. And that's one of the reasons I was so excited to see someone, a believer, writing a book on the issue. My past, I am an engineer turned product manager. And so I work a lot with machine learning already in the products that I build. And whenever I found myself in a conversation around artificial intelligence or things of that matter, I started having these questions and people's eyes just kind of like glazed over a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've noticed, in the church, people are like, I don't know that I want to think about that. I don't feel like it really impacts me. But on the flip side of that, it is impacting us, right? Like we're using artificial intelligence daily at this point. Most of us are. And so I think it's one of the very important conversations that could be happening today on kind of helping the church understand how to navigate and talk about the impacts that are happening. So you wrote this book. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey of writing this book? So I guess it sounds like this book came out of just your role in what you do. But kind of how long had you been researching and doing all this leading up to the point where you were asked to write a book or decided to write a book?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. I think my journey in this started unknown to me many, many years ago. I grew up surrounded by technology, and I'm a little old to say that. A lot of computer technology, that is, because my dad worked for a Fortune 500 tech company most of my life, especially early on. He retired probably 20 years ago or so from that company. And so when I was growing up, I mean, I remember my dad coming in with big he was a computer repairman and salesman, and he would come in with bags full of computer parts, these big blue bags, and drop them in our living room and just pour them out to my mother's disdain. And my sister and I would just build. We would build robots, is what we said we were doing. We had no idea what we were doing, and they were just kind of fun to play with. But from early on, we always had the internet. And most people my age don't say that because my dad actually worked along with some Air Force bases in the area and a lot of things. And so he was really connected to a lot of the old intranets and the government systems. And all that being said, I just grew up surrounded by it. So I was always comfortable with technology, kind of understood generally how it worked. I'm not a developer. I'm not a coder. I approach a lot of these issues more from an ethical standpoint and a theological standpoint. But then kind of my journey going in, I ended up going to college at the University of Tennessee, served in ministry there. I went on to Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, where I earned my master's of divinity. And while there, was exposed to obviously rich theology, ethical thought and formation, and still really didn't know that the Lord was leading me to this path until he brought me to the ERLC. I work in our Nashville office. We have 2 offices, one in Nashville and then one in Washington, D.C. Our DC office primarily focuses on policy-related matters, advocacy, those type of issues. And then the Nashville office is primarily communications and events in the president's office. And while serving on the communications staff, I just started picking up some books that were really interesting to me. Books like Homo Deus, the Brief History of Tomorrow. That's a book by Yuval Noah Harari, kind of a famous futurist historian. Talks a lot about the impact of technology and where we're heading as a society, or where he thinks we're heading as a society. And was really challenged by some of the thoughts that he had and some of the philosophical backgrounds and understandings and predictions of the future. And so as I was doing that, I just started writing. I mean, it was just fun for me. I enjoyed engaging these ideas, was encouraged by my team at the ERLC, and kind of worked my way in a backdoor way into this. I never planned to write a book. I never thought the Lord would give me that opportunity, nor did I have a strong desire to do it, honestly, throughout most of my life. But through my writing, the more I wrote, the more I spoke, the more I was asked to write, the more I was asked to speak.
Right.
And seeing the influence and the ubiquity of artificial intelligence kind of underpinning almost all major technologies, anything that's considered smart, anything that's interactive or personalized is using some type of AI or algorithmic system in order to process that data and provide that personalized type of experience. And so knowing that is obviously the future of computing in some sense, is that AI is going to undergird or at least be part of almost everything we do from now on. I knew that the church, there wasn't a lot of really helpful resources. There just weren't many at all of people engaging the subject. And so the more I wrote, I started doing that. Alongside the book project, is I had the idea of writing this book as kind of a guide for the church and for Christians engaging this issue proactively. I undertook a major initiative at the ERLC where we put together it's called Artificial Intelligence, a statement or an evangelical statement of principles. And this statement was really the first of its kind from a faith community. This is even before the Catholic Church had started to engage some of these issues from a faith perspective back in the early 2000s, but really hadn't put like a definitive statement, an ethical statement or guidelines out for this. And so we were definitely the first Protestant denomination, and likely one of the most first faith groups to really put together a statement of principles where we gathered experts from all across different fields of technology, different areas of society to come together to say, how do we think we should be using artificial intelligence in light of the scriptures? And so that's when we get into a lot of the existential type questions of, is there a God? If so, what is he like? What does it mean to be human? What is technology? And then we started to break that down into issues. And so much of that it's a little bit more formal kind of statement language. I was signed on to by over 80 top evangelical leaders from across the nation, and was widely received as a really interesting and thought-provoking document that stirred a lot of conversation, which was part of our goal. Along the same time I'm writing that and leading that project, I pitched this book to Zondervan and said, hey, what do you think about this? And had put together some sample chapters and said, I really want to take what we're doing in the statement and apply it have a very application-driven approach to this for the church, and pitched that to them. They were really excited about the book and really wanted to push forward with it. And so that's what we did. That's how the Age of AI came about. I was actually writing both of them about the same time. And so if listeners or viewers notice, there's probably a lot of overlap in the sense of some of the language used, but then also a lot of the concepts that we talk about. So whether it's family and marriage and sexuality, I also have a chapter on the family, and we include issues about sexuality, issues of data and privacy is very similar. I have a chapter of that in the book. And the whole goal was to provide a very application-driven explanation for folks to be able to think about these things in light of Scripture and in light of what God says about us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the chapter on family, I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to dive into that, just because I think that could probably be its own podcast episode in and of itself, because it's so big and heavy, the implications there. But let's backtrack just a little bit and talk about kind of a brief history of artificial intelligence, and kind of like hitting the highlights. When did really this technology start coming about? What were some of the accomplishments along the way?
Yeah. So in the first modern usage of the word artificial intelligence, it was kind of coined in 1956, part of the Dartmouth Summer Research Institute. And McCarthy is the gentleman kind of given that title of the father of AI, or one of the fathers of AI. And so he talked about a computer system that has the ability to think or to process, to have an intellect and reason. And they set out really, it's kind of funny if you go back and look at the initial goals that they thought they would accomplish in that summer project. It's pretty ambitious, to say the least. Yeah. It was essentially creating every form of AI that we have today and even more, is actually creating a almost like an artificial general intelligence. And for listeners that don't know about that language, there's two types of AI, three if you count like a very super futuristic type of view of AI. We have what's called narrow AI, which is every form of AI that we have today, which very simply defined as it has a narrow application, like it can do one or a host of things, kind of a set of different types of issues. So an example of that would be Siri. Siri is a natural language processing type of AI. It's able to hear what I say, respond to it, and act upon it, but it's not driving my car around the city. It's not controlling. It might control my Nest thermostat or tell the thermostat what to do, but it's not actually controlling the heating and cooling system of my home. So it's a very narrow application. Then you have what's called artificial general intelligence. And AGI is something we don't even know if it's possible to create. There's only one form of general intelligence in the cosmos, and that's us. Even animals don't have that same level of general intelligence or reason or intellect like humanity does, which, spoiler alert, that kind of sets apart. It's part of the dignity and the value and worth of the uniqueness of every human being, which I get into a lot in the book. And then finally is this super intelligence. And that's often where our minds go for most people. When I say AI, they think of iRobot, Bicentennial Man. You think of Ex Machina and Minority, right. All these kind of like very futuristic type of systems that are like robot overlords. They're going to come steal all our jobs. And we have battle robots, and they're sentient, they're aware, they're beings right. just like us. And we're not even sure that general intelligence is possible, much less a super intelligence. And so a lot of that is mysterious. We don't really know what's possible in that sense, but we do know what's true. As Christians, we don't have to often speculate about maybe what's coming in the future as much as what's already happening and how it's already impacting our lives. And so we use artificial intelligence. I mean, within feet of me are multiple AI systems, whether it's a smart thermostat, a smartphone. We love our Apple HomePod. Not a lot of people have them or love them per se, but our family really likes them. I guess we're just way too tied to the Apple ecosystem to stray too far from the coop, but we enjoy it and we use it every single day. And it's not just entertainment, it's communications and manufacturing and national security, and so many elements of our nation and our way of life is tied to artificial intelligence, but we haven't really given much thought to it.
Yeah. I mean, I've got an Alexa in my office. Alexa was in the kitchen before she started talking without us prompting her. Then she moved to my office where she just controls my lights, right? Like, and brings them on at sunrise, turns them off at sunset, and then I can tell her to turn them on and off at will, things like that. But yeah, I mean, there's multiple things. I've got, even little tinkering things that I use to like program and create, but it's very narrow in its capacity of what it can do.
Mhm.
Yeah. So tell me, we kind of go from the 50s. There was kind of an AI winter of sorts around the 80s, and I think early 90s would be considered a part of that. And then towards the end of the 90s and in the 2000s, we started to see some more progress. And
Yeah.
into the 2000s, I think one of the first bigger accomplishments in the 2000s was AlphaGo. Can you tell us a little bit about AlphaGo and kind of why that was such a big feat in the progress of AI?
Yeah, and so in the book, I talk a little bit saying it's not just fun and games because AI originally, you started to, a lot of advancement and innovation in artificial intelligence was built on the back of gaming. And one
Mm,
of the reasons is because it's highly skilled. There's lots of skills, there's lots of pieces, there's a lot of complexity to a game, but there's very little life impact. If you lose the game or if you knock over or if you don't get the problem right, what does it matter? You just start the game
right.
over. It's not a big deal to lose. It is a big deal if you launch a weapon or you impact someone's healthcare or their banking or communication. So, like, it's a very low risk, high reward place to be able to test these things out. And so, from the 50s all the way up until the 2000s, you kind of have these ebbs and flows. There's massive peaks of innovation, lots of excitement. AI is going to be doing X, Y, and Z. Can't wait for this to happen. And then there's these lulls, these winters of not a lot of progress being made. And a lot of that has to do with a lack of computing power. Computers were just not powerful enough to crunch that many numbers that quickly,
Yeah.
which part of that is you needed new technology and you needed kind of with Moore's law, you needed more transistors and you needed more computing power in order to crunch that. Other parts of it is that we were thinking about how to redesign these systems to maybe have less computing power or to have better reasoning abilities. So they're not having to process every possible reality, but being able to take out the most probable and run the process on that rather than on everything. So that helps us speed things up. By the
Mm,
time you get to the early 2000s, you do have AlphaGo, which kind of makes world news. AlphaGo is a really amazing AI system that plays the ancient board game Go. Most listeners and viewers, including myself, I had no idea what the game Go was, but it's actually one of the most popular board games in the history of mankind. It's played throughout, mostly in the Asia regions. Extremely complex. I don't even remember the number of. It's like 10 to the some crazy number possible moves on a board. It's with these black and white marbles that are on a board. Lots of different spaces. It's extremely complex. So you take checkers and make it exponentially more difficult
yep.
to the point where most of your best and most accomplished Go players they're not processing, they're not running every move. They're doing it by intuition, they're doing it by feel. They can't often explain to you why they do what they do. They just feel like it's the right move. And so you have this system that for the first time in history, it beats Lee Sedol 4-1 in a 5-game match. Lee Sedol was he is the master
The person. Yeah.
of Go at the time, and it shocked the world. We had systems like IBM Watson, Jeopardy. You'd had Gary Kasparov and Deep Blue, which was a chess playing AI, and it dethroned Gary Kasparov, which is one of the world great grandmaster champions. He has a really interesting book, by the way. It's called Deep Thinking, I believe. It's a blue cover by Gary Kasparov. Really helpful. One is an introduction to AI, but two, kind of his story. So it just I'm a
Mm,
nerd for history and biographies. And so he
yeah.
intricately ties his story as a Russian boy rising through the ranks in chess all the way to being a grandmaster. But Go it really pushed the limits of what AI could do from a technical perspective, but it also had like a mass kind of social appeal. Like there were news stories being written. Most people were like, "Oh, what is AI? I've heard about these things, or I knew a little bit about them," but it really goes mainstream. So there's all of this
Mhm.
excitement of what AI can do. And often when it goes mainstream, there's additional funding and there's additional programs. And so it kind of all comes together and just takes off. And that, along the interest, along with the computing power, we were able to start to see things that even AlphaGo, the original system, is extremely outdated at this point.
Yeah.
It took, I forgot exactly how long it took to be able to get to the point where it could play Lee Sedol and win. But then you had a system that was able to do that in 24 hours. It dethroned AlphaGo. It's AlphaGo Zero, I believe.
Yep.
And that just really shows the power and the complexity of these systems and what they can do. But often with that, you get a lot of AI hype, of
Mhm.
AI saying we're able to do X, Y, and Z, and it's going to happen in 5 years, or we're going to be able to do X, Y, and Z in a year. Some of those things come true. A lot of them don't.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we're not using these systems and doing really amazing work within these fields to really benefit humanity. And so then the question comes is, how do we use these things? How do we use these tools for God's glory as Christians, but for social good and for human
Right.
flourishing as a society?
Yeah, I mean, then so we've got Alpha Go that comes, I think, in around 2008, 2010, somewhere around there. It was only, I think, a few years later, around 2012, that Alpha Zero came about. And then around in 2018, there's a product from Google called Google Duplex that utilizes AI. Can you tell us a little bit about that and about kind of the implications and kind of feedback that society had about
Yeah.
that particular product?
Yeah. Duplex, it's the verdict's still out on how great Duplex is. A lot of
Right.
people, especially within the field, are extremely skeptical of Duplex and how it can be used and how it can be applied, kind of mass deployed in society. Um, but when it came out in a developer conference that Google host. As you said, I think it was May of 2018 when it was debuted, and it shocked people because Duplex it was a feature that was going to be built into Google Assistant. And Google Assistant's kind of like the face to their smart assistant, Google.
Mhm.
And so you're able to say, hey, Google, do X, Y, and Z. Luckily, I don't have any Google devices in my house, so they were all just lit up. But all that being said, it would allow you to say, hey, Google, book a table for 4 at this Chinese restaurant or whatever. And the system would then say, okay, I'll do that. Then it would call the restaurant. This is where it was really different. It wasn't interacting computer to computer in the sense of logging into a reservation system, making a reservation for you. It was actually calling. And at the time, it didn't identify itself, which is one of the big kind of issues and ethical issues that people had with it. But it would call, and you can listen to these snippets on Google's website of the system responding in real time. So, hello, I need to book a table for 4 at this time or whatever. Okay, let me do that. Well, I have a table for 5 at this time. And so it could account for variables. It sounded very natural. I mean, it wasn't like me and you talking. But if you're just quickly on the phone, you might have no idea that you're actually interacting with an AI system,
Right.
much less, somebody that's calling, they're actually asking their assistant to do this for them. And so it was very natural. It had lots of ums and ahs and pauses. Could respond in real time to questions and problems. And the system was rolled out to say, well, it might be able to book restaurant reservations for you, haircuts. It was kind of simplistic in its time. But the thought is, look at what we've been able to accomplish and what we might be able to do in the future, where, I can immediately start dreaming of how amazing it'll be that I don't have to sit
Right.
on hold
Yeah.
trying to get my internet bill fixed
Right.
or to sign up for this or waiting with this. And then you start to think people are like, oh, I'll start being able to use this. I mentioned it to my mother who works in the medical industry. And she said, I don't think that's going to work. But what if people start using it to book doctor's appointments and HIPAA and all of this? And it's extremely complex when you start
Yeah.
thinking about how this can be used. Google very quickly at kind of public pressure backed off and said, okay, Duplex is here. We're going to start rolling it out in Google Assistant, but it's going to identify itself as Google Assistant, so people on the other end know who and what they're talking to. And then it was also going to be kind of scaled back. And honestly, you haven't seen a mass deployment of Duplex, but what
Yeah.
it did was kind of a watershed moment of what could happen and kind of spark the public imagination to see what was possible with AI, or what we at least thought was possible with AI moving forward, and showing how it could be used in society.
Yeah, I don't think there's actually been a mass deployment of it. At least I've not seen. And in the last two developer conferences where they announced it, in 2018, you've not necessarily seen a lot of it coming back up because I think of that pressure. Another example, kind of one more example of, I guess you call it an accomplishment, is Tay, that was a Twitter bot that Microsoft created. And it was deployed, and it was supposed to just interact with humans through Twitter. You would tweet at Tay, Tay would tweet back. There was even an image that went along for a profile picture, and it would respond. And within 24 hours, it had to be taken offline, right? Because it became racist, started supporting Nazi propaganda. Like, in that was a fascinating moment in time, because it was like, look how wrong it could go, and look how quickly it could go wrong if it's just left to its own reasoning devices, right? And I think there was a lot of pushback, again, kind of a step back of people starting to think, well, okay, like, do I want artificial intelligence really getting involved and making decisions for myself in that? And I think those are the things that have really kind of kept AI from progressing, figuring those things out. But I want to dive more now, after talking about that. We'll talk about the future here in a bit. I want to dive more into some of the implications of it. So a lot of times you'll hear certain people, put technology on a pedestal. You'll hear them demonize technology as it's, just immoral, the technology itself. In the book, you mentioned that technology is not morally mutual because it influences and changes us each time we use it. Can you elaborate a bit on that statement?
Yeah, a lot of people, when you talk about technology, immediately think, is it good or bad? Those are
Right.
kind of the two extremes. Well, reality is that if we frame it in the way that the scriptures would help us to frame this tool, which is what technology is, it's a tool that God has given us the ability to create, and He calls us to wield with wisdom. Ultimately, as I show
Mhm.
throughout the book, as help us to love God, which Jesus talks about in Matthew 22, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself, recognizing their dignity and value as God's image bearers. And often when we think of technology, we just say it's good or bad, where reality is it's a tool that can be used for good or bad. And if you keep that kind of paradigm, is that technology in that sense is amoral. Like, it doesn't actually, it's in itself, it's not good or bad. It's the way we use it as human beings. But we can't stop there. Because what happens is, if you do that, then technology, it doesn't matter if it's good or bad. We'll just pursue innovation for innovation's sake. And reality is there can be really dangerous applications, misuse, unintended consequences to the way we roll out technology and its impact on real human lives. So when I say that it is moral in that sense, is that it's moral in the sense of how it changes us, how it influences us, the opportunities, kind of expands the horizon of what we can do. Because even, you know, 40, 50, probably 50 or 60 years ago, the idea of like internet pornography, it didn't exist. You had pornography, but you didn't have the internet. But now we have the ability to um, access this type of material anytime, any place, anywhere, which
Mhm.
you didn't years and years ago. And so what it's done is it's really expanded in many ways. I think Karen Swallow Prior says the moral horizon. And so I want to apply that to technology. It's expanding what we as humans are able to do, the things that we can pursue, the things that we can do, the things that we can accomplish. And so that's what I mean by it, is that in itself, it has no moral agency as we do as human beings. We are accountable for our actions. We will stand at the judgment seat before God. We have sinned and have rebelled, but by the graciousness of God, seen in the cross of Jesus Christ, we can have forgiveness for our sins. There's that moral agency that doesn't exist for a tool or a piece of technology. Now, the best part, the thing is that's from a Christian worldview. From a non-Christian worldview, everything I just said doesn't even start to make sense. Because
Right.
you can then start attributing moral agency to these technologies. And that's when you start to get into questions of, can a robot have rights? Can a robot do
Mm.
X, Y, and Z? What happens if we have, obviously we'll be able to accomplish super intelligence. So thus, what's our relationship to super intelligence and general intelligence? You get into a lot of these really difficult moral and ethical questions, but it's because they're starting with their presupposition is a fundamentally different worldview than that of a Christian. We do believe in a creator God who did create everything. Now, there's debate even within Christianity about, was it 6 days? Was it day age there? All of those type
Right.
of things. And I'm not getting into any of that, but just to say is that if there is a God and he did create us in his image, thus not only does he dictate what we do and how we do it, but he also gave us the ability to create these technologies. So we need to be thinking in that category of how can we use these things for good and leverage the good, to mitigate the bad and the evil kind of possibilities of that can be used. So in many ways, we just need to be thinking with wisdom and with care about how we approach the use of technology.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point to point out that AI technology, any form of technology, is a tool like any other tool that, we as humans have created ourselves. And I really liked how you drew that correlation with Cain and Abel, and how, with Cain and Abel, there was technology and tools that were used to harm in that point. And so AI can be used in those ways as well. Let's jump in a little bit to the topic of self and identity. Um, and a lot of people may not think that there's any potential harm to the self or to identity in oneself. I think that there's a lot of things that just people haven't necessarily considered. So, a really core question that I want to get to is, what is at stake when it comes to identity? Why should individuals and also just believers as the church, like Big C Church, why should we be paying attention to the effects of technology and AI?
Yeah, and so the first two chapters of my book. So the first chapter I call the foundational chapter. I get into kind of who is God, how are we, or what does it mean to be human, and then what is technology, and then apply that to AI. The second chapter, I get into some of those, how we view ourselves and our identity, and that's really getting in and expanding upon that image of God section. In that first chapter is to say, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? What's our view, or what's our anthropology? What does it mean to be created in God's likeness? And so getting into some of those questions. So even before you get to how AI is impacting us, we really have to understand who we are. Genesis 1:26-28 says that, let us create man in our image after our likeness. But not only did he create us like him, but then he gave us jobs to do. We're to steward and to care for creation, to name the animals, to work the ground and to keep it. So there's lots of kind of jobs. And I take a view, a representative view of the image of God. There are three kind of main image of God views of the image of God. It's the functional view, the relational view, and the substantive view. The substantive is kind of one of the most popular in church history, and for good reason. It's a very healthy view of the image of God. It kind of bases the uniqueness of human being and our intellect and our reason, a lot of our kind of mental faculties, the ability, like having a soul. It's something substantive about us that makes us different and unique from the rest of creation. There's a lot of really good things in that view, but one of the dangers is how does that view then change when you have somebody who might have a disability, or maybe is in a coma? If they don't have those abilities or that substance in that sense, are they made less in the image of God? Are they not as much in the image of God as you and I am? Do you lose part of the image of God when you lose those things? And so those are tough questions, and they're not questions that are you can't account for within the substantive view. But then you have the relational view, which simply put is that we can have a relationship with God and with others that's different than the rest of creation. Even the animal kingdom themselves, not having that same type of relationship with God. And then lastly is that representative view, that functional view, which says that we are given a job to do, which we see very clearly in Genesis 1, We're given a job to do. We're to represent God. We're to be like God. We're to reign and to rule as his representatives in this world. And that's what I take primarily, kind of putting the emphasis on that aspect of the view. All of the other parts are part of it, but that's really, I think, especially helpful in conversations with AI and technology, because so quickly from a non-Christian worldview, often this is kind of described as a materialist worldview. And for listeners who aren't really familiar with a lot of philosophy or materialism and things like that, that simply means that there is nothing spiritual. Everything is material. Everything, it's a evolution. All evolutionists are materialist. Now, not all materialists are evolutionists, but if you hold to a view that says that we come from nothing and that we kind of evolve to this state, and there is no God, this isn't a theistic evolution. This is a non-theistic evolution. Our basis of morality and ethics just comes from kind of social constructs. There isn't really anything valuable or unique per se about humanity if we can create something better, stronger, faster than us. Well, you start to see a lot of this kind of creeping up, not only in the sciences in general, but specifically in computer science and AI, where it's saying if we can create a machine that can think like us, that can act like us, that can perform tasks like us, then they're going to be just like us. They're going to have equal value and worth. Now, we might not be as crass to say that, and maybe we're not going to be audacious to say that as clearly, but in reality, that's kind of what that worldview devolves down into, is that if we can create something better than another human being, or equal to, then that thing has the same value and worth and dignity. And that's just really antithetical to the Christian worldview. We don't come from that perspective. We ground the human dignity and value and worth, and even our ethics and our morals, and how God has created us and what God says about us and how God calls us to live. And so some of the questions that come up about identity is to say, well, you kind of have this consequentialist worldview or utilitarian worldview that says your value, your worth is based on what you do rather than who you are. So thus, my 94-year-old grandmother who lay dying in her bed, in that moment, she could contribute nothing to society. She couldn't talk. She couldn't feed herself. She couldn't care for herself. And in that instance, she is not as valuable as the 26-year-old tech executive or hotshot. Her value is based on what she contributes rather than who she is. But a Christian says, no, that's completely antithetical to the gospel message and how God has created us. She has as much value, dignity, and worth in that moment than the baby in the womb to the 26-year-old tech executive, because we're all created in God's image. We're given different jobs and functions. So what AI is causing us to do is, because of the amazing developments and innovations within the technology and how it's being applied, it's very easy to start questioning, well, what does it mean to be human? We start questioning our identity. We start questioning ourself and our value and our worth. And that's where I really, in that chapter, trying to hone in on what does it mean to be created in God's image? And then how does that apply to our tools and our technologies? And then further on, how does that apply to how we use these tools and technologies? Are we pursuing human dignity and flourishing in every application, or are we kind of adopting a utilitarian or consequentialist worldview to our decision making?
Yeah, so let's dive in a little bit on that. So there's two parts that I think are brought up most when talking about this: is what is intelligence and what is consciousness. And I'd like to start with kind of the definition of intelligence. Can you kind of expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, and so these are the consciousness, intelligence. I kind of touch on them in the book. I don't really focus a ton on them because I'm trying to get to make it very applicable to everybody when they're thinking about how do we use these tools. But simply put, like, intelligence is the ability to perform. I don't want to use intelligent because that's defining it by its own word, but intelligence, the ability to accomplish complex tasks, essentially. So an intelligence, we have certain intellect or abilities or reason. So as humans, we're able to do, even as a 3-year-old, my son now can talk to Siri and ask her to play songs and to do X, Y, and Z. And so he's exhibiting that kind of intelligent behavior. We see that in animals to a very low extent. We used to have a dog, and our dog knew where his food was. He knew exactly what to do to be able to get us to feed him or take him outside, or he knew he had to go
Right.
to the bathroom and he had to go outside. So like he's exhibiting some intellect and some ability there, but he's not doing it nearly to the level that a human being is, even my infant son. And even with these machines, you have they are intelligent. That's a really debated term, especially in some Christian communities. I often hear when I talk about AI is I'll be told AI doesn't really exist. That's just a misnomer. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, I understand what you're saying, but they're conflating intelligence and dignity and value, kind of the image of God. That's one of the problems with the substantive view in my mind, is that you can easily say, well, this really isn't AI because it's not like us. It's not really intelligence. And that's where I think you get a difference between AGI, superintelligence, and narrow AI, why that's an important category for us to have. And then you move into like, what is consciousness? Well, it's being aware that we exist. Like it's the awareness. And again, animals do have some level of consciousness and awareness, not to the same level that humanity does. You think we can't base our value, dignity, and worth on these attributes or these substantive types of our parts of us, because then you even look at like angels. Angels themselves are highly intelligent, can communicate with humans, are more powerful than humans. They even have cool wings that we don't have. They're just able. They're a different type of being. And so if you say, well, we're the crown jewel of creation because of our intellect, our ability, our reason, that very quickly breaks down into saying, well, what about angels? What about animals? What about this? Aren't we just a higher evolved form than all of these other things? And I think you get into a lot of lack of clarity, specifically just because we're defining terms differently. And so that's why I try to think of, no, AI does exist. Intelligence is something that's other beings and even systems can experience, just not to the same level or degree. But again, it all comes back down to that fundamental point is you are not what you do. You are not what you think. You are not what people, even you think you are yourself are, is that you are created in God's image. You are made in his likeness,
Hmm.
like nothing else in all of creation, and that will ever be created. And that's a really important point for Christians in these conversations. No matter how advanced a piece of technology becomes, no matter what time in the future till Jesus comes back, we are not going to be able to create something with more value, dignity, and worth than us.
Yeah.
So we need to make sure that we're keeping a human focus in the sense of understanding how do we use these tools for God's glory and for the love of neighbor. And that's what I mean by human focus, is that we're pursuing the love of neighbor, human dignity for all people as we deploy these technologies, ultimately to honor God and to love him better.
Yeah. I heard um, pastors and people in the Christian communities that talk about, like, especially I think I saw some video that was around the 60s, 70s that was talking about, well, intelligence is what sets us apart. And so
Mhm.
nothing could ever be intelligent. And I think it's been discovered like that's not true. Something else can be intelligent. That's not actually biblically what sets us apart
And
here.
it very well might be the degree of intelligence as well. I just think that that is not maybe the most helpful category, especially with the technologies and with artificial intelligence. That's why I lean more on the functional view. But it's not like a line in the sand. It's the image of God is more complex than we can really put into human or into our terms.
Right.
So that's why I
Well,
do think it's kind of like I had a youth pastor one time that talked about the cuts of a diamond, is
mm,
that you have the diamond, it is the whole, but you kind of have these different cuts and different aspects of it. And I think that's very similar to what we talk about with the image of God, is it really is a combination of all three. But I think
right.
especially in light of these kind of pressing moral and ethical questions, I think leaning in on that functional view is going to be really helpful as we start to engage these issues and engage differing worldviews as we try to together say, how do we use these technologies in society for human flourishing?
Yeah. Do you think going to consciousness, do you think that it is or would be possible in the future for consciousness to be created? Do you have much of a view on that? And
Yeah.
if so, like again, I think we want to anchor on the fact that it's the fact that we're created in the image of God, and anything that we create is in the image of ourselves, not of God.
Mhm.
But do you have a view on whether or not consciousness would be attainable to create on some spectrum, like not consciousness as we have it, but
Yeah.
consciousness as maybe a dog or something like that?
And that's where I'm not one to speculate too much, because often when you speculate, you're wrong. You talk about the idea of most computer scientists, well, at least very well-known computer scientists, kind of have a date in mind for when they think we're going to achieve
Right.
general intelligence, and they always set it at least 20 years in the future. And I read somewhere, it was a book that, and so this isn't my idea, I just can't remember the name of the book or the author, but they said they set it just far enough that they really won't be in the limelight or in public
Yeah.
when they are found to be wrong,
Right.
because they wanted to speculate, put some kind of date on it, but that's just far away enough that they're, even
Yeah.
if they're wrong, it really doesn't matter.
Right.
So to that end, I don't know per se. I tend to lean towards no,
Mm.
simply because I don't believe that consciousness arises just from the material.
Mm.
So when I'm thinking about a materialistic worldview, if you hold that worldview, say that consciousness, morality, the sense of self spawns from material, spawns from essentially nothing. Um, that's a really hard worldview for me to stomach and to hold. And so that's why I think that's antithetical. The materialism is antithetical to the gospel and to Christianity. But I just think it's difficult to say, yes, we'll be able to create it, because I do believe that consciousness is something that God gave us. Like he created us as conscious beings, and the animals to a different extent. So that's where I don't want to speculate too much.
Yeah.
I lean towards no, simply because I do reject materialism, full
Yeah.
stop. But it
What else?
also is a difficult question to answer, in the sense of
Yeah.
and I get into the book on this, is maybe it's not conscious, but maybe it can fake us into thinking it's conscious.
Mm. Mm.
That's the Turing test. The famous
Right.
mathematician and computer scientist Alan Turing talked about this Turing test, where the machine is able to fake or to confuse us, or to make us believe that it actually is real, or that we're talking to another human being. And if a computer can make us think that, it's passed the Turing test. And that's where he would say that the machine is, well, he might not use the same term, but a lot of folks would say that makes a mark of an intelligent machine, or some level of consciousness or something like that. And I have a hard time stomaching that and don't really hold to that. But again, I don't think we have a lot of clarity on that, but what we do have clarity on is exactly what you said, is that no matter what we create, it's never going to be like us,
Yeah.
because we are created uniquely in God's image. And so, as opposed to a lot of the popular worldviews, or even some of the popular examples, Max Tegmark, famous physicist at MIT,
Yeah.
wrote Life 3.0, being human in a AI, kind of the age of AI. In his book, he talks about all these different views of what the future is going to hold. And I always think they're kind of funny when you read them, because it's pure speculation. I mean, it can be
Yeah.
informed speculation, but it's still speculation nonetheless. He talks about like that we might end up being like the animals and be caged in zoos, so that the AIs can come and visit us and check us out and kind of ooh and awe at us. And I just think that's really funny when you think about it, because that's devoid of the Christian worldview that says that, and it's saying we can create something better than us, or more valuable or dignified than us. And I just full stop reject that as a Christian.
Well, yeah. So I do kind of want to dive into Max's viewpoint, because the reason for diving into the viewpoint is because I want people to understand the other viewpoint, and to
Mm-hmm.
like hear what their points are, and then again to reiterate why it is that the Christian world viewpoint, we believe this, and why that isn't truth. But in Max's book, so I read Max's book, I think it was last year, like when it first came out. And he created the Future of Life Institute. He's gathered a bunch of scientists from different worldviews, though the Christian worldview is not represented on that. I just want to point that out. But I think he would be open to having someone on it. You should definitely apply. But he talks about in his book that the role of humanity that he believes is just wisdom to steer the AI. Like his future is the only thing that should separate us is that we have the wisdom to steer it, that we don't let it lord over us, I guess you would say, in a sense. And while I agree, like, again, I would agree with that. I don't think we want something steering us, and nor do I necessarily think that something could steer us. I think he's looking at it from like a safety standpoint.
Mhm.
One of the famous stories that he gives is the person that didn't detonate a nuclear bomb, or I think it was a Russian ship that didn't, attack a U.S. ship, because it ended up being a fluke. And had he hit the button, which all the alarms were telling him to hit the button and shoot against the U.S., he would have started World War III like very easily. And so I think he really talks about he's coming at it from a safety perspective. But one of the things that he says, and I'm trying to find it here, is just that it's the only role for humanity is just to rule over AI with wisdom to steer the technology. And I think, again, what we would say is that's a very weak role. One, like, if that's just what humanity amounted to, is just to help steer this technology, I don't think that gives any more purpose than what we're doing today. And what we see in Scripture and in Genesis is we get a clear understanding of what humanity's role is, designed by God. And I think that's important to hold to when we have conversations about technology and whether something is conscious or intelligent. So let's talk a little bit about the effects on society with technology. I think there's been a lot of studies that have been done around the impact of becoming addicted to technology, and kind of the effects of loneliness, depression. What are some of the things that we've seen over time that happen as technology has just grown more and more prominent in our lives?
Yeah, I think, and part of that is, even this isn't specifically with AI, but often innovation is sold as the ability to connect us and to build social bonds, and that's kind of the whole point of Twitter. I remember one of the or
Mm,
social media at large, but specifically with Twitter, I remember when I signed up back in like 2009, I actually got my name, Jason Thacker. At Jason Thacker is my Twitter handle, which is pretty crazy. You don't get those now
yeah, I'm
because
jealous
so
about
many
that.
people that are on there. But when I signed up for it, I remember watching this video, and it was talking about how I like baseball, and like I tweeted, I like baseball, and but your friend that you didn't know like baseball likes baseball, and now you have like this connection, and it was just a really silly video. But that's the promise of social media and
Yeah.
really technology, was that we have the ability to connect with one another, and we do. And we
Mm,
see that is specifically within the midst of this pandemic with COVID-19, is that
yeah.
we're reliant on technology to maintain and to maintain social bonds and familial bonds, but even to be able to connect, to have a podcast like this.
Right.
We're reliant on technology to do these things and to stay connected. But just because it says that that's the goal, that doesn't always mean that's the what's actually going to take place, because we know from study after study after study that social media is actually breaking us apart. It's tearing us at the seams, because we're showing a lot of the division and the tribes and the tribe of tribes. And so as society continues to fray, you feel those tensions. We kind of saw it slowed down, I think, when the COVID-19 pandemic really took off,
Mm,
specifically with the United States. But you see this kind of national unity, you see this kind of coming together. We're not really talking about a lot of the divisive issues, but we're getting to the point in these shutdowns and these stay-at-home orders that you're starting to see a lot of the tensions kind of being brought back. I mean, we do have an election coming in November of 2020,
right.
and it's a consequential election. There's lots of different things at stake here, and you are going to start seeing this tribalization of
Mm,
humanity, which has always been the case. But technology, again, it expands the horizon of what we're able to do, and maybe even the tribes and kind of the factions that we can come into, because we can build our personalized, which again is something that can be really good, to have personalized technology, specifically with AI. But it easily becomes this individualistic rather than this kind of community focus. So we focus on me and how special and unique and maybe amazing and things that I think I am.
Hmm.
And I start to devalue the other human beings that are also created in God's image, just like me, that breakdown of community and society. And we start to see that with loneliness, even, is that you're kind of sold this bill of goods of how this technology is going to keep us together and connect us. But then we're sitting for, people sometimes are sitting for hours trying to manicure this perfect Instagram photo, this kind
Yeah.
of curated look to talk about how amazing their life is while they're hollow and just worn out inside. And they are what we think is just a quick snapshot. And how beautiful is that? They're spending hours meticulously crafting this. And we do that. Everyone does that. It's not just people on Instagram or those who are called social media influencers. We all do that. We want to portray ourselves as a certain type of person, whether that's a reader or a writer or a creator or a developer
Yeah.
we're always trying to portray this image of ourselves. But I think what the scriptures would call us to, and what the Christian worldview would call us to, is understanding that we are created in God's image. But the ultimate call on us, it isn't to love God, love ourselves, and love our neighbor. That's not the greatest commandment. The
Yeah.
greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love our neighbor as
Mm.
ourselves. God already knows we're going to love ourselves. We're fixated on ourselves.
Right.
That's part of our rebellion and part of our sin, even, is that we think we are the center of the universe. But
Yeah.
when we get our eyes up off of ourselves and up to God and see God for who he is, then we see people as he sees people. And that whole shift in the paradigm, I think, is going to help us to address this isolation, this loneliness kind of, I don't use this word lightly, but it is in many ways a pandemic.
Mm.
Um, that it's spreading and it's spreading uncontrolled and we're not even really thinking about it. And again, that's why I wrote the book, was to hopefully stir some of these conversations, to say we need to be thinking wisely about how we utilize these technologies, because they are so powerful and they are
Yeah.
so useful and beneficial, but they come with a lot of unintended consequences that, Twitter didn't think that when it launched, it thought it was going to connect people over baseball and similar interests and likes. And now
Yeah.
it's become a propaganda platform, a
Yeah.
misinformation platform. And they're having to deal with all these things that they never thought
Heavy
were going
issues.
to,
Yeah.
yeah, they never, ever, ever thought that they were going to have to deal with. And now they are.
Yeah.
Um, and that's just a reality of every piece of technology. And it's specifically going to be with AI because of the power and how it can be used. There's just a lot of danger in it. And so I think we just need to be wise about how we approach those things.
Well, and we are designed by God for that human to human connection.
Yeah.
And what's so funny is, I finished your book just this week, and it was a couple of days ago that my son, he is very extroverted, always wanting to hang out with his buddies and everything else. But right now we have to stay at home. We can't go just hang out with our friends and play with our friends. And he was like, "I've got an idea, Dad." He's 7. He's like, "I got an idea. I'll build a robot friend that I can play with just like I do my other friends." And the whole book just like came to my mind as like, actually, this is a point where I can encourage him that, hey, look, it can be fun to build robots, but we really want to have fun with our real friends. Like, we should desire to have real connections with people, not just something over like with a robot or just to another person through a screen. It's funny how it just showed me God desired us to have that connection, and now it's like my kids are growing up around computer parts and everything else, and they're just like, well, I'll just build a friend. I'll just build this intelligent thing to just and I don't think that that's going to like go away. Like, I think
Mhm.
there's a lot of people, and you talk about this, and we won't necessarily talk about it here right now, but maybe in the future, talking about people to all types of desires are creating technological things that feed into that, but it's again from a selfish point, not from loving God and loving our neighbors. And I think that is going to be a very important conversation as time goes on. I want to shift a little bit into talking about medicine. And so talking about medicine, you talk about it as it is a form of technology. So it's something that can be used for good, for evil. It's not necessarily moral in and of itself. The actual medicine. Um, I want to start with maybe how the view of our bodies changes in the future with AI and technology as it continues.
Yeah, it all comes back down again to the image of God. That's kind of the whole
Yep.
premise of my book, is getting into the
Yep.
image of God and how that applies in every area, but it applies here too. There is immense good being done in medicine through technology,
Mm.
specifically in artificial intelligence, from research, even researching and pursuing vaccines and antivirals and all types of things, especially in the light of this pandemic. But we've been doing this for a number of years. There's so many good innovations that come out, and there's so much just real world good being done with artificial intelligence
Mhm.
and medicine. But often we don't think of some of the unintended consequences of how AI can help, can really devalue us as human beings, or we see ourselves or our bodies, even we kind of see that split of the mind as the real person. And you see this in a lot of people like a Max Tegmark, or you all know
Mhm.
Ray Kurzweil, where the brain, the mind is the consciousness is who we really are. But we're in these containers, these bodies that in their minds, and well, not in every one of their minds, but this is a pretty popular notion, the idea of it's called software and hardware. My brain
Right.
is my software that I don't really upgrade per se, but my body, I can upgrade at will. So if I'm
Mm.
able to have superhuman strength because I can have amputations and then put robotic arms on, why wouldn't I? And so that's kind of a very forward kind of fringe view of the body. But there is this view of the body, this devaluing of the body that says that who I am is really my mind. It's really my thought. It's really my consciousness and my emotions and all of that. And so my body isn't that valuable. You see this is really popular within the transhumanism movement. And transhumanism, it has nothing to do with sexuality. Often when you hear of trans, you think of transgender,
Right.
but transhumanism is transcending our bodies. Our humanity is the ability to upgrade ourselves to be more than we really are, which is a pretty low view of humanity, honestly. Is to say not that we're the crown jewel of creation, is that we might be the current crown jewel of evolution. And thus, there is something that's coming after us that we will evolve into, or something will evolve and pass us on this big race to the top. If there is a top, it's this continued type of evolution. And so, and how AI is really changing how we view our bodies really comes back to this kind of idea of transhumanism, the ability to transcend our humanity, to upgrade ourselves as if we're not good enough or valuable enough or created the way that God intended us to be created. And so that view of the body, I mean, my father, I opened that chapter up talking about medicine with my father, who is a recent, in the last couple of years, amputee. He lost his leg to a pretty intense disease, vascular disease, where he had to lose his leg, and he has an upgrade, is what he always calls it, of this kind of material leg that's really strong, but it's also like he's not the sum of his parts. A lot of people would argue I remember him sitting in the hospital and he was joking that he was going to be a foot shorter after surgery. The doctors, some of them like that and thought it was funny, and some of them thought it was really weird and kind of crass, but that's just my dad. He always jokes about that kind of stuff. Um, but that idea, if we are just the sum of our parts, which is a worldview that's very, very popular, if we're just the sum of our parts, this kind of materialistic worldview, then him losing that makes him less human per se.
Mm.
And so thus we have to upgrade him or give him something. And that's just a kind of antithetical again to the Christian worldview that says that our value and our worth isn't dependent on who we are. It's not dependent on what we do, or it's not dependent on what we do, not who we are. It is who we are. It's created in God's image. But it's also not the makeup of our body. But the Christian worldview informs, when we talk about transhumanism, the immense value of the body. The body isn't a container that contains the real us. The body is integral to us. So much so that the Lord and creator of the universe took on human flesh. He became man. So he was fully God and fully man. And when Jesus then lived that life, he lived the life we were supposed to live. He died the death that we deserve to die. And he was resurrected on the third day to give us life. He is still embodied and will be for eternity. And I think a lot of times when we talk about AI and medicine, specifically in this idea of upgrading ourselves in transhumanism, we forget about our embodied Savior. We forget about this idea that he didn't take on flesh of another animal or flesh of something else or some type of superhuman flesh. He took on our mortal flesh to raise us from the dead, as he rose from the dead, as if we're Christians. And so I think that's just really important to keep in mind when we're talking about these issues, is that we aren't to upgrade our bodies at will, or we're to pursue restorative uses of technology. But this kind of idea of enhancement, I think, really betrays what we believe as Christians in terms of human value, dignity, and worth. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't use technologies for good. Like even our glasses themselves are a form of technology that allow us. But for me, it didn't give me better sight. It just helped to restore the sight that I lost. I don't have the best eyes in the world. The effects of sin and death are real, and they really are affecting our bodies, and the breakdown of our bodies with disease and virus outbreaks and pandemics, and death itself isn't natural. But the Christian worldview and the Christian gospel is that we will one day be raised from the dead like our embodied Savior.
One of the things that I'm struggling to, I guess, kind of come to terms with here is a technology like Neuralink. So Neuralink, for those that don't know, is a company that Elon Musk backed, and they've been working for many years on being able to put just a small device that would live under your skin on your head, and they're essentially like little electrodes that go into parts of your brain. There is a read and write component of this where it reads your brain activity and can help even with understanding how one's brain works. But there's also the potential in the future for the right aspect, where it actually helps you process information faster. It could be helped to help prevent like Alzheimer's and dementia, and like help in that area. And so that's where I'm starting to like, it sounds like a far off thing, but there's already trials of this technology starting to come into play. And in 10 years, I mean, their expectation is that you would just go to like some place to get this quick operation done to have this put into your head. And I think it's a timely conversation to have of where the Christian worldview, how it would view this type of technology, and whether it's, I mean, because on the one hand, it is restorative in some medical capacities, could be restorative. On the other hand, it's enhancing the way that you process information faster. And so what are your thoughts on just that subject?
Yeah, I have to be really kind of forthright, as I'm not a medical ethicist. I can dabble in some of those areas. So some of those questions I don't feel I'm super equipped to be able to answer. But what I can say is, from a theological standpoint and an ethical standpoint, is that we need to keep that idea of human dignity at the core of everything we're doing. So that idea of restoring, there can be real potential and uses there. That innovation can be really good for humanity, but it's easy to fool ourselves into believing that we'll be able to overcome sickness, disease, and death. Ultimately, even you see this in Harari's book, where he talks about how originally we had the three big issues that humanity faced were disease, plague, famine, and war were the three main areas. And he said, by and large, we've overcome those. It's interesting to read that in light of the pandemic that we're experiencing, because
Right.
it's kind of out of control. But he would say that by and large, there just were mistakes made, but we know how to fix them. And if we could, one day we'll be able to fix these things. We don't have massive outbreaks. We don't have the Spanish flu again. We don't have the bubonic plague. As we did years ago, because of medical technology, because of human knowledge. And so he said, by and large, we don't have famine, plague, and war and if we do, we know why it happened. So now he kind of sets our sights on something else. Two new grand adventures. One is overcoming death, and the next is becoming gods. That's where he writes about Homo Deus, the God man. Interestingly, And he knows this. Christians already believe in a homo deus, and his name is Jesus Christ. We don't need to be homo deus because we know the one who is. But that idea of being able to overcome death. So I think in medical applications of AI, really just medical innovation and technology in general, and a lot of the emerging technologies, there's this hope that we can overcome our weaknesses, overcome our deficiencies, overcome, in Christian terms, sin and the effects of sin on our lives if we just have the right advances and the right technologies. You see even like Elon Musk, when he talks about we need to upgrade ourselves, he's kind of a promo for Neuralink. But the
Right.
idea of we need to upgrade ourselves to be able to keep up with the monkeys. And what he's meaning is this kind of Darwinistic evolutionary type idea is that the monkeys were like us. We were just like them. But because of evolution, we took off and evolved so much further than the monkeys. So we kind of outpace the monkeys. So now we don't want to become like the monkeys and let these technologies take off. So we have to upgrade ourselves. We have to upgrade our minds and our processing
Mm.
abilities and our physical bodies in order to keep up with the machines. But I think that's where the danger comes into play. Like I understand how you get to that point. But you also have to start with some of these presuppositions of this materialistic type worldview, which we've talked about at length already, but I talk
Right.
about at length in my book, is that if we have different starting points, and so thus the needs that he might think we have to have in order to keep up with the monkeys, I don't think we do because I start with a different worldview. And I think that's really important when we're engaging a lot of these technologies is it has to always come back down to, is there a God? And if so, what is he like? What does it mean to be human? And what is technology? If we get that order out of whack, or we misinterpret or misunderstand some of those fundamental questions, or come from just a completely different worldview in itself, we get to very different applications of what we need to do as humanity. And I think that's where really what we need to keep in mind is that as Christians, we're coming from a different worldview than so many who are saying we must do X, Y, and Z. I just don't believe we do, because the humanity is resilient, but humanity is more so created in God's image, and God already knows what's going to happen. And that's one of the things I think that's encouraging for Christians when we talk about any type of technology is we already know the end of the story. It's easy for us to get
Mm.
fearful, to be anxious, to be overwhelmed, even in the midst of this pandemic, to say, I don't know what's going on. I can't control this. But one of the things the Lord can use this, even this current season, but really our entire lives, is to realize that He is God and we are not. We don't need to upgrade ourselves because we are His crown jewel of creation. We know Revelation 21 that all of the people of God are going to be gathered around the throne saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. He is reigning. He is ruling, not only then, but now. So
Yeah.
thus we can engage a lot of these pressing social and moral and ethical questions with the hope of the gospel, but hope in the King Jesus, who's already defeated death for us. And so in the meantime, and in this part of this time that we're called to live, is how then are we going to love God and love our neighbor? And we will see different applications of that, even within Christianity, of is this good or bad, or what's the moral calculus on X, Y, and Z? We might come to different perspectives, but we need to start with the same starting point and then
Yeah.
apply that ultimately for human good and human dignity.
Yeah. Well, I want to jump over to work because it's kind of it can be a bigger topic, but I specifically want to hone in on a couple of parts here. So AI taking over jobs is something that we've already started seeing really some impact of that. I went to a McDonald's in New York, and there was no people at the counter. It was just all the kiosk, and it was just like put on there. And I just like walked away with it. And so like there's already some impacts of technology kind of taking over, but this isn't the first time we've really seen technology in human history eliminate certain jobs. And I think in your book you talk a good deal about how like we society shifted right in the types of jobs. The printing press, people used to write by hand copies of the books, and now that's not done anymore because of the printing press, and how that was a big shift. But eventually everybody moved, and so I wanted to have you kind of talk a little bit about maybe about the I guess you'd call it worth that our work has. And but from the Christian worldview, how should we associate with our work, and what is the kind of right place for work in our lives?
Yeah, and that's again, you kinda start back at some of the fundamental questions again, and I hate
Yeah.
to sound like a broken record, but you have to,
Yep.
when you engage a lot of these tough questions, because if we start with today as the starting point, we're gonna end up in a very different place and
Mm,
often a very bad place compared if we look at the whole of human history, but ultimately we look back to those kind of fundamental truths is that work isn't, something we have to do. It's something that we were created to do. Work isn't something that happened after the fall. It's something that was
right.
created and instituted before the fall, which means it's part of what it means to be created in God's image is to work. Now, that looks different for different people in different times, but we are created to work. And
Mm,
especially in a time of economic crisis, it's helpful to remember that it isn't our work that defines who we are. Um, it isn't our work that defines our value, our dignity, because there are people experiencing massive joblessness right now, as they have throughout human history. But specifically in the midst of a pandemic, you see a lot of people losing jobs. I think this week it was 22 million unemployment claims. If we base our dignity and value based on what we do in the terms of this, our work or our vocation, we easily can see people who are not working as less valuable. They're not contributing to society. And so, but if we understand work as part of the created order and how we're called to be, then we also know that there's a necessity to work. And
mm,
so technology kind of, in my mind, always kind of gets a bad rap. It's the job killer. But
right.
in many ways, technology is also a job creator. Um, we often think of these kind of dystopian views where the robots are going to take over and we're going to be living either really terrible lives of joblessness or the really euphoric lives of this kind of utopian future where it's just life of leisure and rest all the time. Well, neither of those things sound appealing to me, because that's not how God created us. We are created to work, but also to rest. We have those rhythms that we see in how God created the world in 6 days and then he rested. So that pattern of
Mm,
resting and working. And technology can help us to lean in on those things and to do a better job and to balance our lives. Technology can also create massive number of jobs as it has. I mean, I use an example of elevator operators from like the early 1900s. We don't have elevator operators unless you're in a really fancy building, and even then, it's more for show. It's not actually out of
right.
necessity. We
Yeah.
have computer systems that control these now. We don't see massive riots in the streets of former elevator operators demanding rights and jobs, or how dare this technology take over their job. No, we're innovative, we're creative, we can take on new skills and we can adapt to the circumstances. We're creative. There are jobs that exist today that never even would have been thought about 5 or 10 years ago. And so, in that sense, technology can create innovation, can create a multiplicity of jobs. But there also are going to be real world consequences where automation and AI do take jobs. You think of even just self driving car technology.
Yeah.
There are estimated 3.5 million truck drivers, which I say thank you to truck drivers in the midst of this pandemic because they are really feeding America and keeping us operable. Um, but if you tomorrow, which isn't going to happen with self driving car technology, it isn't going to happen in one moment that we just flip the switch and everything goes automated. It'll be more of a process and kind of a gradual ease into. But if we had 3.5 million people lose their jobs tomorrow, which kind of sounds small compared to how many people have lost their jobs in just the last couple of weeks, then you that affects the rest of transportation, which really gets in like the 10 million mark. That's a massive economic crisis.
Mm,
That's a massive crisis that, as I'm saying it, it really fails in comparison to what we're experiencing right now with 22 million unemployment claims.
right.
Um, there is mass devastation in our societies and our churches where people will be indulging in drug use and addictions and abuse and pornography and all sorts of different things that are really degrading to the human value and degrading to the image of God,
Mm,
because of the loss of jobs. And so it's kind of that balancing act. Technology can pursue and help to create a lot of things, but it also does have real world effects. And so, as the church, then how do we think about these things in light of human dignity, in light of the love of God and love of neighbor, to pursue innovation that is building up humanity. We don't stop innovation just because it is going to hurt some. It's how do we care for those who might be impacted by these technologies and these innovations. But again, we don't look forward to a jobless future. We
Yeah.
hopefully, Lord willing, will look forward to a future where we get to work and we get to do things maybe that free us up from a lot of the monotony and the mundane kind of tasks that we used to do. Just because we can do it doesn't mean we should.
Yeah. And I like how you talk about like it helps us, technology helps us kind of get away from the mundane task, because as image bearers of God, we are creative just like he is the creator. Like we're image bearers in that instance as well, of being creative and creating these technologies and creating things that can help us to ultimately, from the Christian worldview, love God and love our neighbors more. um, and I love, just quickly talking a little bit about the career advice that we would give our kids. You talk about Max Tegmark's book. He has a few questions there. That's one, does it require interacting with people and using social intelligence? Two, does it involve creativity and coming up with clever solutions? And three, does it require working in an unpredictable environment? And I think one of the things that I've found in my own career is that, while I was a programmer, an engineer, and did all these things, empathy is really the skill that I've been honing over the last decade or more. And that's the skill that I think has really gotten me more opportunities. And I was, I guess, surprised to find that it wasn't really the hard skill there of coding that made me better at my job and better working within teams, but really it was about empathy. And so yeah, I wonder if there's any other kind of advice or topics around just career advice and empathy that you
I
may
think
have.
those are some of the main ones. I really appreciated Tegmark's questions that he put in there, and that's one of the things that I think is helpful for Christians to understand when we're engaging those, even those that we um, disagree with on
Mm.
major issues. There are times that we can glean from them, just as hopefully they will glean from us. Often, when I talk about these
Yeah.
technologies or I talk about the impact of society, those who fundamentally disagree with everything I basically say, from a presuppositional standpoint or from a moral standpoint, do appreciate certain things. And I think that's something that's really important. And interestingly, is something that um, kind of goes back to what is being created in God's image and seeing the value, dignity, and worth of all people, and that understanding that God does give knowledge. There is a general revelation. There is a way that this world
Mm.
is created to function, that we can learn from people who we disagree with, and kind of
Yeah.
modeling that idea that we can have convictions and beliefs, but we can also be kind and we can also learn from one another. So I appreciated Tegmark's questions there. I think they're really helpful. And again, it gets down to like emotional intelligence and social intelligence and emotional intelligence. That's
Yeah.
something that you see a lot of that. Even my college degree is in communication studies, which most people laugh at, because when you think of a communication studies degree, most people aren't communication studies people. I mean, they're just going into other fields, but it's because we kind of honed our speaking and our writing and our
Mhm.
interpersonal and group communication that we can kind of function in a lot of different areas. So it gives us a lot of flexibility. Kind of I joke, but the highest paying communication studies major from University of Tennessee is Peyton Manning Goval's. They actually had to take his salary out of our salary kind of picture as a graduate. But it's funny because you look at people and they're in medicine and they're in communications and they're in policy and they're in political science and medicine and all of these different areas,
Yeah.
because we kind of have that skill that transcends a lot of different types of skills. And so I think that's really important for us, especially as we're connecting with our children and raising families in this age, is to push people and push our children and even ourselves to be thinking of how do I uniquely contribute to my society, to my church, to my family, something that's unique and distinct about me as a human being created in God's image.
Yeah. So, kind of winding down, what are some resources that you would suggest if, I think, the person I kind of think of as myself as a parent, as I'm, parenting my children. That's one use case, but just in general, just learning about technology, and then about the Christian worldview, and kind of educating yourself on these types of topics. What are some of the resources that you would suggest people look at?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, being connected to a local body, a body of Christ, a local church, is one of the most important. Is because through that we're going to see that kind of moral formation. We're going to see that worldview formation through the preaching and teaching of God's word. And so, knowing God's word better helps us to address a lot of these issues. One of the early reviews of my book, The Age of AI, the guy pointed out the fact that it was just saturated. He kind of said it was like a technology Bible study, which I took as a badge of honor. I don't know if he meant it that way. But I was like, no, that's something I want, because I want people seeing that it isn't just Jason's idea. It isn't just so-and-so's idea. This is what God says. This is his word. And so I think it's really important for us, as we're raising families and as we're navigating this digital age, is to navigate it with wisdom, grounded in something greater than man's knowledge, grounded in something like God's word. And so I think that's something that's really important for us, is to ground ourselves in God's word. And then from that, there are tons and tons of helpful resources, Christian and non-Christian. And I reference a ton in the book. You can look at the footnotes. There's a number of them there. I'll probably forget a lot of them. I did benefit a lot from a lot of the kind of popular AI works, AI Superpowers by Kei-Fu Lee. I thought was helpful. This Life 3.0. It's a pretty long, pretty thick book, but there are a lot of things that you can draw from it. In terms of Christian books specifically, there aren't a ton on artificial intelligence, which is one of the reasons I wanted to write mine. But in terms of technology in general, Tony Reinke has a really helpful book, 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You. And then also, there's a book by Andy Crouch called The Tech-Wise Family. He actually has a new book coming out, and I forget the title. It's a play on that with him and his wife later this fall, which seems to be a really helpful work from what I've seen. And there's a number of books kind of in the process. I know Professor John Lennox from the UK, or from Ireland. No, he's from the UK. Professor John Lennox has a book coming out on AI as well. Kind of a lot of kind of the ethical implications and social implications of AI, which I think will be a really helpful book. I look forward to reviewing it. And then you get into just a lot of books about society and culture. So it doesn't have to be just specifically technology. Is that really, if technology is ubiquitous in our society, so it's affecting every area. So just generally learning about various areas of marriage and sexuality, about human dignity, about the end of life and beginning of life. And a lot of those kind of issues, I think, will really aid us well as we move into this new and very quickly changing culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, the book is The Age of AI, and Jason Thacker is your Twitter name, and I think your name just around the internet overall. So feel
Early
free.
adopter.
Yeah. I'm definitely jealous of that. Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. Really appreciate your time, and look forward